simulation theory. Sim theory, right? Who's my favorite rapper? You thought it was Wiz Khalifa? Is Rizwan Virk. That's my favorite rapper. Rizwan Virk. This, because of the popularity of video games and the internet and everybody spending their time in the virtual realm, and because of the coming rise of the metaverse, etc., the new hip gibberish is that reality is an illusion, bro. We live in a simulation, dude. And then you got popular people promoting it, restating it. Now, as we did multiple talks in the last, several weeks on simulation theory. I read several chapters out of Rizwan's book. And I think that because remember we talked about this, there's so much evidence for reality at a very fundamental level being structured and designed and having order and structure. The fabric of reality is just literally like designed, obviously. There's so much evidence suggesting that and showing that I think what's happening is this older notion of everything being chaos and flux and meaninglessness, matter and motion, that's being revised. And they want to be able to say, okay, well, we can't really hold back on that nonsense anymore. The floodgates are open. People are figuring out that reality is clearly super, super designed, highly structured. So we got to have some kind of new gibberish nonsense myth that's out there to help explain it. And I think simulation theory is that. And we've had generations now, at least 2 generations of people raised on video games and the internet. And so they just magically, automatically think everything is like a video game. As if that's some deep thought. No, it's not. The fact that because there's design in the video game or in the computer world or in the virtual world, and it bears similarity to design in the external world of this world, does not mean that this world is a computer simulation. First of all, that's idiotic. Number 2, if it's a simulation, you could never know it. Because your coming to know it would also be part of the simulation and thus by default part of the illusion. This is the problem with all solipsistic worldviews, you see, self-refuting. Also, you have the problem of the naturalist determinist fallacy, which is that if you're merely a programmed computer running through all the program responses, then there is no free will, and you're not actually coming to learn that reality is a simulation. That's also just programmed into the simulation, you see. So you don't actually know if it is the case. It's self-refuting. And thus, all deterministic systems are subject to this critique of the naturalist fallacy. There is no choosing the true over against the false because you're merely programmed to choose what you're programmed to choose. Therefore, there is no choice, you see. So the denial of free will actually removes the possibility of truth. Truth requires objective choice, the ability to contrast the true with the false. And if there isn't that, then there is no actual distinction between the true or the false. There's no reason why one ought to choose or that we should link up truth to the correct or the good as opposed to false with the bad. There's no difference between the two. It is the equalization of all outcomes and all options. They're the same. That's self-refuting. So simulation theory is not only nonsensical, it's also self-refuting. It's also impossible. And the only reason that people find it convincing is that they're noticing that, yeah, there's design in the world. Duh. I'm not advocating the teleological argument in its classical formulation. But the fact that I think that's a bad argument does not mean there's not design. There's design everywhere. It's all designed. It's all a manifestation of the order and pattern and archetypal superstructure of the divine mind. So of course it's ordered. Of course there's purpose and structure. Duh. But because that's the case, I'm not going to leap to some stupid... The only reason I would come to that stupid ass conclusion is because I've lived my life playing video games like a bunch of dumb Zoomers and millennials. So you play video games for 20 years and now you think reality is a video game. Come on, dude. Really? The only reason you think that is because you spent too much fucking time in a video game. Number 8. This one is related to this last one, and this is because there's a connection between the good and the true, right? So if we're going to talk about being in metaphysics, right? Metaphysics directly relates obviously to being, to existence, to the good. And there is a direct connection between existence and the good. Now, they're not necessarily identical, but in some ancient philosophers, medieval philosophers, it might be identified. But for our purposes, we're going to just consider these in the transcendental sense of the being and the good, and how they relate to, for example, the beautiful. So in a lot of ancient and medieval aesthetic theory, you have the idea that there are standards of the beautiful. So art and the arts are not purely relativistic. They do have to match up to notions like harmony, symmetry, order, right? So pure chaos isn't beautiful because there's a requirement for harmony and symmetry and proportion for there to be actual aesthetic value, which is thus then connected to the good and the true, and not the false, right? So aesthetics is, in some people's philosophy, classed under ethics, or perhaps classed under metaphysics. But regardless, what we see with metaphysics and aesthetics is that there's a connection between the two. And the connection relates to being and the good and the true. So being or existence is intimately tied to, it may not be absolutely identical to or reducible to the good, but in our philosophy, in our metaphysic, it is. So God creates and declares things good because they reflect him in a certain way, namely in that they have being or existence. Now, created being is not identical to uncreated being. It's not identical to God. But there is a reflection between God's existence and the existence that creatures have, because they are made according to his own being and goodness. And so they reflect him in that way. Not in a perfect way, but in an imperfect way. Thus, beauty relates directly to the harmony and the order and the patterns that pre-exist in God that also exist in the created order. And so thus, to align oneself to the true and the good necessarily then relates one to the beautiful. And thus why many philosophers and thinkers point out that God is, of course, the highest of the most beautiful things. God is the ultimate beautiful being because he is ultimate existence, ultimate truth, ultimate good. So what we see then, my point here is that there's a fundamental union in the midst of the distinctions. There's still a fundamental union, namely unified in God himself, between these different categories of being or philosophy that we might call, that we class under metaphysics. The true, the good, the beautiful. They're reflected in this world, and they all necessarily relate. For example, I can't have the good without the true. And truth and goodness necessarily relate to one another. Because if I think things are true, it follows that I think one ought to choose the true and not the false, you see. So there's an ethical dimension to the true, and that's because trueness and truthfulness relate directly to being and existence, which is itself a reflection of God. God is good, and so created being is a reflection of his goodness. Thus, creatures, although not the highest good, are still good. And thus they can reflect beauty, the beauty of the Creator, who is the archetypal beautiful one. So all of that to say that if you understand that, then you would understand that it's impossible to say that beauty is completely relative. Aesthetics is not totally emotive and relative. But 90 to 95% of the modern world would say artistic preference is just relative, man. Whatever you want, dude. Whatever I want, dude. And so relativism spilling over into the domain of aesthetics is the destruction of the arts. Thus, the arts becomes weaponized and turns into garbage modern art, garbage abstract art. And now the demonic, people vomiting on canvases, people putting crucifixes in urine, people, H.R. Giger with all his demon art, right? That becomes the new beautiful. Well, because beauty is relative, bro. Who are you to say that dead babies aren't beautiful, right? And literally, H.R. Giger art's a bunch of dead babies. So I include in my top 10 list number 9, beauty is purely relative. And that's because the denial of metaphysics is necessarily the denial of the good, because the good is under the domain of metaphysics. And the good is also connected to epistemology, because the good relates to the true, which is under the domain both of metaphysics and of epistemology and ethics. Thus, they're all interrelated. Thus, why you see so much horrible art and the complete destruction of the arts in general. Music, film, mixed media visual arts, whatever else arts there are, plays, right? It's all going to the trash. I mean, ultimately we know by design, but this is why, in terms of philosophy. Philosophically, this is why.